Hi. So, what I want to talk about today is the wasted potential of narrative in multiplayer games. Something I think about as community-driven narrative. And I'm not talking about the stories being told. Don't get me wrong, there are some egregious stories out there, like Horizon Zero Dawn or Darksiders 3, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about what story is being told. I'm talking about how those stories are told. Like, every medium should strive to take full advantage of its strengths when telling their stories. And this problem isn't exclusive to our medium. It can be found in every single one of them, of course. In literature, you can be too blunt with your descriptions. In comic books, maybe you don't take into consideration the way the panels are structured, presented, and reviewed. In movies, maybe you don't take full advantage of the many aspects and tools of cinematography, lighting, composition, editing. When it comes to video games, the greatest strength, the thing that really sets our medium apart from the others, is interactivity. You're not just watching the story unfold, you're participating in it. But unfortunately, a lot of games forget to be games when they're telling the stories. They remember to be games when you're in the bits between the story. You play a little bit, you shoot some things, then the story unfolds in a cutscene. Then you go back to playing the game, and then the story unfolds again in another cutscene. But I've talked about that before, and what I want to talk about today is the next layer of that, which comes from multiplayer games. Because they provide yet another possibility space for narrative, which is not just each individual player's interaction with the game, with the story being told, but how all players interact with each other and collectively with the game, with the story being told. And I haven't seen any games that explore that space, that realm of possibility. So let's talk about some examples, right, to illustrate what I'm talking about, this concept. There are two games that I think might be good examples that I've played to some extent: League of Legends and Final Fantasy XIV. They're both online, they're both multiplayer, but they're widely different from each other, right? One is a MOBA, competitive MOBA, and the other is a more traditional MMORPG. And okay, let's start with League of Legends. And yes, I know there's not a traditional narrative in that game, but there is a narrative. I've said it before, every game has a story to tell. Games aren't just blobs of pixels fighting each other, right? They all have a narrative, whether it's terrorists versus counter-terrorists, Nazis versus allies, or this bunch of champions against that bunch of champions. There's always a story being told. And in League of Legends, most of that story, like 99% of that story, is the characters' backstories. And you can read about those stories in their bios. But that's basically it. There are some neat interactions in-game between champions. They will say specific lines of dialogue to each other sometimes. That's neat, that's cool. But that's just like the usual banter that you have in single player RPGs, right? Like in Dragon Age, depending on which followers you have with you at any given time, they will say specific things to each other. And the thing is, any way you slice it, that's just a very predetermined linear expression of the story. And it isn't ever influenced by your actions as a player, as an individual. And they're also never influenced, more pertinent to the topic today, they're never influenced by how players interact with each other and how the entire community interacts with the game. So some things you could experiment with, for instance, they have items in League of Legends that can build like something that's called a vendetta or something like that, that builds over time to give you an advantage against one specific champion on the other team, right? Okay, let's take that and let's, instead of making it predetermined and linear like that, make it emerge from the gameplay in how the players are interacting with each other. Like maybe if one champion is repeatedly killing the other champion over and over again, the champion that's being killed builds a vendetta against its nemesis. You know, one becomes the nemesis of the other. And this can manifest in the gameplay, which is tricky, I know, but it can be done, can most certainly be done. And also taking the banter stuff and putting it in it, right? Have the champions say things to each other like, not you again. Or maybe if one champion is carrying the entire team, the other team, whenever you have a group fight, members of your team can say something about that, like, thank God you're here, or if you're not, if the entire team starts a fight without you, they can remark on that as well, like, where's our fucking carry? Or the other team can say something like, let's see how tough you are now without your carry, or something along those lines. Just something that comes from the interaction between the players, anything at all. If you're a support and repeatedly save one specific champion from getting killed over and over again, they can thank you for it, or again, show up as gameplay mechanics too, not just the banter. And that's how the players are interacting with each other, right? In a match by match basis. But you can also expand that to take into consideration how all the players across all the matches are interacting and how those stack up. Like, for instance, there are always the most popular champions in each season, and they can make comments about that in game. Oh, here comes the special little boy, everybody wants to play with that. Or if nobody's picking that champion, they can say something about it as well. They can build the vendetta style mechanics across the matches, take averages. And yeah, it doesn't have to be just the vendetta. There are a myriad of mechanics that you can implement, buffs and debuffs, and you can take all of that and have it interact with the more robust portion of the narrative of this game, which is the characters' backstories. Like, competitive games get patched all the time. Things get buffed, things get nerfed all the time. Those are already driven by how the community engages with the game, right? They buff and they nerf stuff based on things that are being exploited, that are too OP, or champions and skills and builds that are underperforming. But what does that mean to the narrative? You know, why did this one champion get buffed? Like, there's this one champion called Timo. I think he has been getting buffed like every season for a while. Why? What does that mean? How does that affect his story? Have all those collective changes be reflected in the story? What happened to him that made him get stronger? Or some champions get massively nerfed sometimes. What happened? Why did he suddenly get so weak now? Or weaker, Like, he was so strong and now just what happened to them? I know it's a lot of work, but it can surely be done. They have the means to just have those interactions that the community are having with the game as a whole, as a community, and have those influence the outcome of the narratives. A major blind spot that I always thought strange is in League of Legends, if I'm not mistaken here, but in League of Legends, you don't ever play as the champions that you choose. You're always a summoner, right? And you summon these champions to play in these matches for you. You're controlling them. And if I don't remember, I think they do it to gain favor with the summoners who are just massively powerful wizards. Something like that, man. But how does that affect their story in their world? Like, there's a whole world. They have different nations and empires fighting each other, and some characters are the nemesis of others and they want revenge or whatever. That some of them are relatives and lovers. There's politics in that world and fucking wars, and they want to carry favor with the summoners, but how does that affect their world? How does that affect their stories? If a particular champion is being favored, actually being favored by the summoners, if they're the most popular one in this season, then how does that translate into their story? What does that favor mean to them? Or if a bunch of champions, like there's Noxus, I think it's like this empire that likes to invade and conquer other regions. And if in any particular season their champions are being massively favored by the players, what does that mean? How will that affect the story of that nation? What benefits do they get from this favor? Like, they invade other nations. How does that change that dynamic? Which nations are they able to go after now that they couldn't before? So, yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there. Even in a game like League of Legends, in MOBAs in general, that don't usually have, they really don't have a traditional narrative, right? There isn't a story being told in the traditional sense, but there's massive world building, and they try to make us care about these champions. Like, they all have personalities and backstories, and there is a story there that just needs to be tapped into. And this massive potential of having what we do as players mean something to that story, I personally think that something like that would be greatly rewarding as a player. Okay, next example, we can talk about Final Fantasy XIV, as I said before. Final Fantasy XIV is an MMORPG. It's heavily narrative driven. It's famous for it. Like, you can even kind of play it as a single player RPG for the most part. And then you have to get together with other players to do raids and stuff like that. Well, are they called raids? But other than that, like through the main bulk of the narrative, of the story being told. Whatever other players are doing doesn't really matter. For the most part, it really kinda is a single player game. And that's kinda par for the course with MMORPGs, right? You can have stuff like, what's that game called? Guild Wars 2. I played a little bit of it. And you can have a separate PvP server where different regions can compete with each other, and then yes, what you do matters to the outcome of that emerging story that's being told. There's this conflict in this particular area, and whatever all the players do collectively will influence the outcome of that war, of that battle. Who's going to win? Who's going to lose? It isn't a straightforward affair. It is dictated by players and their interaction with the game. But that's always something set aside, right? Why not bring that to the actual narrative of the game, like the main story? You can have, for example, you could have stuff like Final Fantasy XIV gets updated all the time with new story content, right? But that's always driven by whatever the writers want to say. It's never our story in any way. It's always their story. They dictate what the story is going to be, and then we play through it with no actual input. Our only input into the story is a binary win or lose state machine, where you either beat the bad guys and get to watch the next cutscene, or you don't beat the bad guys and then you get to do it again. You get to try it again until you beat the bad guys and you watch the same next cutscene. Okay, so let's bring the players into the story, right? For example, in Final Fantasy XIV you have different nations and different regions, and you have bad guys. Well, what are we doing collectively that could affect that world, that could have an impact in that world? Like, you can start in one of 3 different cities and you're an adventurer, and adventurers are the bread and butter of this world. We get everything done, apparently. So what if one particular nation state is being favored by most adventurers? They have a relative bigger influx of warriors. What does that mean to the politics of this world? How will that affect the story, the world building? And if you build your game with this concept in mind of tracking the interactions of the community as a whole, collectively, with the game, and using that to inform the direction of the narrative. Like, you can set up quests that are either optional or where players can choose different outcomes, and the outcome of these quests don't have to impact the world state right now. They don't have to be meaningful outside that player's interaction with the game at that very same moment. But those choices can be collected as data and used to inform the next update, like 2 updates down the line, I don't know, to give them time, right? To implement the changes, to take this data into consideration. And so maybe most players in any given nation state are choosing like the quote-unquote bad option in most side quests. They're always killing everybody, or they're choosing to save as many people as they can. How does that influence the world, right? Like 2 patches down the line, oh, this nation state is kinda getting rough, right? Like, it's not as safe as it used to be. People are just dying. The adventurers there are kind of turning bloodthirsty, and maybe that influences the politics as well. Or maybe you have a nation state. I don't think this specific example can be applied to the world building of Final Fantasy in specific, but let's say you have a nation that is usually very cutthroat, fraud, that is usually very cutthroat, but they're getting this massive influx of healers and support characters, and most players are choosing the merciful path in their side quests. So you can build in a story of redemption for that place, right? Or the downfall of another. There are so many things you can do. There's just so much potential there in the possibility of incorporating the player base as a whole, our actions collectively influencing this world that we're supposed to be inhabiting. And they could make this game's narrative so much more meaningful. It would feel so more rewarding playing through them, being a part of that story. I don't know, man. It's just such it's just so much waste of potential. You've been given this opportunity and apparently you're not even looking into it. Some games try, some developers kinda try. Like, I think Miyazaki kinda tries. The community aspect is important in the world space, but it doesn't ever influence the outcome of the story in any way. Kojima, whom I believe is kind of a failed cinematographer, like playing his games kind of feel like he wanted to be a movie director. Like it kind of feels like he's making a movie in a game. Such long cutscenes. But he kinda tries. I know, I think he tries. He just doesn't know how to get there. Like there's the nuclear disarmament cutscene in Metal Gear, right? That was completely community driven narrative. Like this one instance. And I haven't played Death Stranding, I just look at it from a safe distance. But it kind of feels like he was trying to get something like that done in that game. It feels like he had the idea to do it, but didn't know how to implement that. If you've played the game, maybe you know what I mean. But yeah, so that's the spiel for today. I think beyond what single player games have been wasting in terms of narrative, multiplayer games are wasting even more because there's so much more potential there for interesting storytelling. A kind of storytelling that is truly unique to video games. No other medium can deliver on this kind of storytelling, on this kind of narrative. Just video games. And they're not doing it. I wanna play that shit before I die. Okay, so yeah, again, that's the spiel. And alrighty then. See you around. Stay safe. Till next time. Bye.